Antonio just turned 75, but he felt much younger. That happens when someone lives in peace with themselves and doesn't conflict with the outside world. Antonio lived in a pleasant house he proudly built himself throughout his life. He dreamed of becoming a farmer, but it wasn't possible in his advanced age, becoming an entirely unattainable goal. Antonio tried not to dwell on it much and kept hope for the future. Those who knew Antonio knew the real reason behind his setbacks: his children. They believed others were responsible for their happiness. Carolina and Daniel were born just a year apart and were deeply loved by their parents. Everything was fine until they became teenagers. Daniel was the first to develop issues. He often got into trouble due to poor performance in school and frequent absences. Some said Daniel was involved with gangs and engaged in highly suspicious activities at night. For some reason, the teenager managed to escape consequences. When the police got involved, Antonio tried to talk to his son. Unfortunately, nothing good came out of that educational moment. Bianca was the first to realize her son was heading down a questionable path he chose himself, but like any mother, she continued to hope he would improve and achieve something positive in his life. However, when her daughter Carolina started following her brother's steps, Bianca began to despair. She couldn't understand how her children had become so unbearable. Of course, the parents made every effort to steer Daniel and Carolina in the right direction, but unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. Tired of endless fights and confrontations, Bianca understood she couldn't continue living that way. There had been disagreements before between Bianca and Antonio, but they finally reached a point of no agreement. Bianca decided that divorce was the best solution for their situation. Bianca's decision sent Antonio into a severe state of shock. He hoped they could help their children, but when left to deal with the problem alone, he understood that everything was destined to fail. After the divorce, Antonio faced the real problems, as his children had already veered off and barely graduated high school. They refused to continue their studies and began living a life that was practically akin to that of outlaws. Carolina and Daniel abused alcohol and spent their father's hard-earned money. Rumors had it that meanwhile, Bianca remarried and started a new life. Antonio harbored no resentment toward her, knowing he was also responsible for what happened. Time passed, Carolina and Daniel continued to get into many troubles. Daniel spent time in the county jail, and Carolina had several unsuccessful attempts to start a family. Antonio repeatedly begged his children to come to their senses and think about their futures, but it was all in vain. Antonio eventually grew tired of his futile attempts to reason with his children and accepted reality. When he heard a knock on his front door, he immediately knew his son or daughter had come to ask for money. Being a kind and caring father, he never refused to help his children. He tried to give them everything to make them happy. Unfortunately, Carolina and Daniel's happiness relied solely on having access to money to buy alcohol and some food. Despite their age, the siblings didn't work and behaved as if they were children of a millionaire. Meanwhile, Antonio lived very modestly to save some extra money for his children. Deep down, the man understood he couldn't influence his children anymore. Therefore, he tried not to notice their oddities and not dwell too much on their way of life. "Hello, Dad, how are you?" Carolina asked as soon as he opened the door. Antonio began to respond but was immediately interrupted by Carolina. "I can see you're fine, you even bought a new sofa." Antonio lowered his gaze and felt embarrassed. He indeed bought a new sofa because he couldn't sleep on the old one anymore due to back pains. After entering his father's house, Daniel and Carolina started walking around, examining and measuring every room. Antonio didn't immediately understand what they were doing, but when he did, he started feeling uncomfortable. you know I have heart problems and need money for surgery, and you really don't need such a big house. After all, it was designed for a family, and you live alone." Carolina began to speak. Antonio wanted to say something, but Daniel picked up where his sister left off. He began to complain about his bad luck and a loan he had taken from the bank. At the same time, he didn't mention what he had taken the loan for. Antonio didn't have the habit of micromanaging his children's every move. After all, his daughter's health was at stake, and Daniel could also suffer if he didn't repay a loan. Given his criminal background, he could even end up in jail. "So, what should I do?" Antonio asked. "In reality, you don't need to do anything. We've taken care of everything. A place has been arranged for you in a nursing home. There, you can spend time with people your age and not worry about the future. You'll always have food and clean clothes," said Daniel. Antonio considered Daniel's words. He didn't want to leave his home at that age, but he also didn't feel comfortable not helping his children. Maybe the nursing home wasn't such a bad idea. There was some reasoning in what Daniel was saying. Otherwise, who would take care of him in old age? Antonio thought he'd have a week or two to pack, but Daniel insisted they pack immediately. "What will happen to my dog?" the man asked anxiously. "We've already taken care of that and found a place for him in an animal shelter," Carolina immediately replied. Antonio felt incredibly bad and guilty because Rex, Antonio's loyal friend for over 10 years, would be forced to live his days in a shelter for stray animals. But on the other hand, Carolina's health was at risk, and Antonio wasn't willing to sacrifice it. So, he started packing, feeling sad. Actually, he didn't have much to pack. He lived modestly. He rarely indulged in new things. The sofa was one of the few new things he had bought some time ago, but it wasn't something he could take with him. "It's okay, Dad, we'll ask the new owners of the house to buy a sofa from you," Carolina reassured her father on the way to the nursing home. Antonio felt very uncomfortable. He worried if he would fit in at the institution and make friends. Meanwhile, Carolina and Daniel were thinking of something entirely different. Mentally, the conspirators were already dividing the money they would receive from selling the house. Carolina had no financial issues, and Daniel hadn't taken a loan from the bank. It was all a scheme to steal money from their father. They had already found buyers and only needed to get their father out of the house. To Antonio's surprise, the nursing home was actually very pleasant. He was immediately surrounded by care, acceptance, and attention. Of course, the institution couldn't replace a real home, but it was certainly better than many other places where the elderly ended up. As they bid farewell, Carolina and Daniel promised to visit their father in a few days. In reality, however, they had no plans to visit him. After selling the house, Carolina and Daniel plunged into a whirlwind of drinks and endless parties with their friends and acquaintances. The money they received from selling the house didn't last long. At the same time, they failed to realize that their father basically had nothing to sell. 2 weeks flew by like a single day for Carolina and Daniel. Waking up from a binge, they realized there was no more money, and something needed to be done. That's when Carolina suggested they ask for their father's life savings, some of which he had set aside for his funeral. Being a prudent and organized man, Antonio always had a certain amount of money saved to cover funeral expenses in case he passed away. Probably many people do that, and Antonio was no exception. Daniel really liked Carolina's idea since easy money always appealed to him. While the siblings were concocting another story to tell their father, Antonio was working on a plot of land located behind the nursing home. It's worth noting that the nursing home was situated in an incredibly beautiful area. A river ran a short distance from the house, and lush forest grew on both sides of the river. It was challenging to build a house there. Only a few privileged individuals could afford to buy land in that location. Antonio put on his gardening gloves and began pruning roses and removing last year's leaves from the lawn. At that moment, from the corner of his eye, he saw a woman heading towards a 2-story house, located half a kilometer from the nursing home. Antonio knew that wealthy people could afford to have a house in such a desirable area. The passing woman's face seemed familiar to Antonio. "Bianca, is that you?" Antonio exclaimed in surprise. The woman stopped and looked at Antonio, who was dressed in work attire. At that moment, a sweet smile appeared on her lips, and Antonio knew it was really her. "Yes, it's me. How did you end up here?" Bianca asked, still in disbelief. Antonio shuffled from one foot to another and began explaining that he had sold the house to pay for Carolina's surgery and Daniel's debts. After hearing her ex-husband, Bianca turned pale. Unlike Antonio, she didn't believe Daniel or Carolina's stories. Therefore, without saying a word, she immediately called her assistant, who handled all sorts of delicate matters. As it turned out, after divorcing Antonio, Bianca married an influential businessman who was 15 years older than her. They happened to live together for a short while. After that, the millionaire passed away, leaving his wife a considerable inheritance. Of course, Daniel and Carolina didn't know that their mother was wealthy and lived in a house that cost a fortune. After bidding farewell to Antonio, Bianca promised to visit him soon, and meeting his ex-wife stirred the warmest feelings for Antonio. Deep down, he still loved her and hoped that one day they could return to their old lives. Bianca's investigation revealed that Carolina and Daniel had deceived Antonio and had already squandered the money they had received from selling the house. At the same time, the cunning children didn't suspect that Bianca would tell the truth to Antonio. When they visited their father, Antonio already knew about the children's deception. "Dad, we need a bit more money," Carolina began, to Daniel's great surprise. Antonio shook his head and said he wouldn't give them anything. "Dad, what do you mean?" Carolina was shocked at that moment. Bianca suddenly appeared, and Daniel and Carolina were visibly uncomfortable. The siblings realized their lies had been uncovered, and they wouldn't get any more money. Moreover, Bianca and Antonio decided to live together, saying, "Live however you want, but forget the way to our house," to the children as they bid farewell. Carolina and Daniel took a long time to recover from what they saw. They couldn't believe their eyes as they watched Bianca and Antonio walk away. Despite the couple's age, they decided to start anew. Now that the former couple had everything they couldn't even dream of before, their lives were sure to change for the better.